While perusing the waterside and countryside of Harford County today, it is difficult to imagine how it appeared in the early 1600s. At that time, it was only inhabited by Native Americans who left behind rock carvings that today we call petroglyphs. Written documentation, however, came along slightly later, and this is the point where 300 years of Harford County history begins.
In 1608, Captain John Smith explored the upper Chesapeake Bay in the area of present-day Harford County and encountered indigenous people known as Susquehannocks. According to drawings on his map, these Native Americans lived in long houses constructed of bent saplings covered with broadleaf grass, and they subsisted to a large degree on growing maize that today we call corn. Also supplementing their diet were wild deer and turkeys from the forest, and fish harvested from the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. The year was 1634 when two ships, the 40-ton Dove and the 350-ton Ark, landed in America to establish Calvert's St. Mary City in a new colony to be called Maryland. Here was built a state house that would govern the colony, which included passing laws and issuing land grants to settlers desiring to establish homesteads. About 2 decades later, the first grants of land in present-day Harford County were allocated along its waterfront in the areas of Gunpowder Neck and Bush River Neck. Access to water was important, as travel through the undeveloped forested inland was not practical. After establishing their indispensable housing, outbuildings, and gardens, settlers turned their attention to crops that could produce an income. John Rolfe at Jamestown, Virginia, had introduced a sweet-scented strain of tobacco that produced a good yield and found a ready market in England, despite the fact that King James had declared it loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the growers. Nevertheless, when shipped abroad, it was a marketing bonanza, producing a sweet profit for Marylanders who became addicted to its production. Growers of this money-making product soon found that repeated tobacco crops quickly depleted the soil of its nutrients, causing settlers to migrate inland for richer terrain, thus being forced to create paths and roads for travel. Moving tobacco to a waterfront landing was done by packing it in a large, wooden, straight-sided container called a hogshead, and through the use of a harness and animal power, transporting it over so-called rolling roads to a ship loading area. It is worth noting that the town of Bel Air was laid out on Scott's Old Fields, a term used to describe tobacco-depleted soil. With profit from tobacco farming occupying the attention of early entrepreneurs, shipbuilding was slow to take hold in Harford County. In 1669, Christopher Tapley established a boatyard on the north side of Possum Creek that was near Loderick Creek on the south side of the Bush River. This Edgewood area is now part of Aberdeen Proving Ground. Another trade that was gaining a toehold along the paths and roads of Harford County was cart and wagon building. The most difficult part of these vehicles was the spoked wheel, and the local forest was replete with nut-bearing hickory trees that yielded better spokes than any wood found in England. The name hickory derives from a Native American word that is a shorting of pucker chicory, or another similar term. Its wood is known for its strength and its ability to flex without breaking. It's believed that the first brick structure built in what is now Harford County was a courthouse in Old Baltimore town, which in 1674 was on the east bank of the Bush River. In most cases, bricks were made from locally mined clay that, in this case, contained very little iron. So during the firing process, it remained white rather than turning red. By 1712, the courthouse had been relocated to Gunpowder Town, also known as Joppa, which was emerging as a bustling shipping port. Specifications called for the new governmental structure to be built of brick, 24 by 35 feet, with a highly pitched roof 13 feet above the first floor ceiling joists. In 1766, a brick vestry house was constructed at St. George's Church in Perryman. and was revered for its good proportions and pleasing design. There are many stories about 18th century American houses being built of ballast brick from England. These ships usually carried ballast stone, and construction bricks were most often made locally. To stimulate the development of water-powered milling, beginning in 1669, Maryland passed a series of laws allowing an individual to have 20 acres of a so-called mill seat condemned, provided the individual would build a grain mill. With declining overseas market prices for tobacco, farmers transitioned to growing sustainable wheat, and by 1692, Harford County's earliest mill, powered by Bynum Run, was in operation on a land tract called Come by Chance along Maryland Route 7 in Bushtown. Parts of Maryland, and Harford County in particular, were geologically well positioned for the establishment of water-powered mills, as both areas were geographically located along a fall line between the Piedmont Plateau and the coastal plain. This led to stream names such as Jones Falls, Gwynns Falls, and Little Gunpowder Falls, that is one of Harford County's boundaries. Over time, the number of Harford County mills rose to about 85, with most grinding grain, while others sawed logs, fulled woolen cloth, pressed oil out of seeds, pulverized flint, and ground bones into fertilizer. 3 mills have been preserved by acquisition of state and county funding. These are Jerusalem Mill on Little Gunpowder Falls, Eden Mill on Deer Creek, and Rock Run Mill in the Susquehanna State Park. All of them can be visited by the public. The presence of slate, primarily for roofing, was discovered in Harford County by 2 immigrants from Wales, William and James Rees, in 1725. For the Harford County villages of Cardiff and Cambria, it was the opening of the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal between Wrightsville, Pennsylvania, and Havre de Grace in 1840 that would bring economic benefit to their area. Canal boats could deliver the heavy slate to distant markets at a reasonable cost, thus bolstering the local economy. Slate also found other uses in school classrooms and in graveyards. Recognizing the importance of iron to the Maryland economy, in 1719 the General Assembly authorized the condemnation of 100 acres of heretofore uncultivated land for the purpose of a forging mill for ironworks. Iron furnaces were brick-lined stone structures that were loaded from the top with layers of limestone that was sometimes oyster shells, charcoal burned from nearby trees, and locally mined iron ore. A water wheel turned a shaft, activating a bellow pumping in air to make the fire hotter. After sufficient heating, molten iron was drained off at the bottom into sand pits, producing cast iron ingots known as pigs. Using the 1719 condemnation legislation, Stephen Onion in 1741 obtained 100 acres of land on Little Gunpowder Falls, just north of Joppa, and constructed an iron furnace. This was the first such operation within present-day Harford County. The Bush River Iron Works was in operation by 1746. This was followed by Harford Furnace on Bush River in 1830. LaGrange Iron Furnace in Upper Harford County was online by 1836. Sarah Furnace, south of Jarrettsville, was producing iron in 1843. In Havre de Grace, the Rough and Ready Furnace operated by 1845. By 1750, there was a large country store along Old Philadelphia Road as part of the Bush River Iron Works, which had been provided to serve the needs of their workers. As well, the store sold items to local farmers and travelers passing through. As much travel was still by water, stores sprang up at ports, frequently visited by ships. Grist mills were sometimes the economic engine of a local economy that could support a store, while in rural areas, crossroads were a preferred location. The architecture of a store very much depended on the builder, but some generalized characteristics did evolve. Many were 2-story structures with the store name on the upper level that could be seen from a distance. Most often, the second level of the store served as the living space for the store owner. There were no windows on the first floor, thereby providing additional shelving space. A front-located hitching post provided a tie-up for the animals of visiting patrons. A room under the steps leading to the store's entrance was used for storage space of low-value items. The front porch allowed room for overflow stock and new items to attract customers. After entering a country store, your eyes had to adjust to the darkness, and a visitor was always greeted by a variety of smells that included tobacco smoke, cured leather, and pickled fish. Oliver McCourtney's restored store at Jerusalem Mill can be visited today, but the fragrant odors are no longer present. When settlers arrived in what is present-day Harford County, the area was covered with trees such as poplar, beech, chestnut, walnut, oak, and hickory. Beginning about 1660, many were cut down to build log cabins, barns, and stables. But it was sometime after 1700 when the first sawmills were erected and the county's first agricultural crop of trees were harvested into lumber. The Upper Jericho sawmill began operating in 1769 along Little Gunpowder Falls and produced the material to construct the adjacent Jerusalem flour mill. This sawing facility was demolished years later, but today the Frank Thomas sawmill on Falston Road is still in operation. When the Baltimore County Court in Joppa was moved to Baltimore City in 1768, the area residents found it too distant for satisfactory service and petitioned the General Assembly to establish a more convenient location. The governmental body responded, creating Harford County. It was to be bounded on the southwest by Little Gunpowder Falls, on the north by the dividing line with Pennsylvania, on the northeast by the mighty Susquehanna River, and on the southeast surrounded by the bountiful Chesapeake Bay. The General Assembly originally specified the location of the courthouse to be at Bush, but this did not satisfy Harford County residents, who held an election in 1782 and moved it to Bel Air. Many kitchen gardens and farms during colonial days included fruit orchards, and in fact, when some landholders leased parcels, the tenants were required to plant apple trees. Thus, cider became the nearest thing to a household beverage. It's likely that most cider was obtained by hand-crushing apples in a wooden bowl, but later on the process was made simpler using a cider press. For larger quantities, apples were squeezed by water-driven machinery and taken to the kitchen in barrels. In the early 1800s, the raw material for plaster, called gypsum rock, was imported from Nova Scotia and Canada. It arrived in pieces that had to be ground into a powder by a mill, then heated to dry out moisture, before being bagged and remixed with water for use as a wall or ceiling covering. There was a horse-powered plaster mill along the Susquehanna River in the area of Labadum by 1806, and one as late as 1880 in Havre de Grace. Today, plaster has been replaced by gypsum board, a sheet of plaster sandwiched between two layers of paper. The 1810 industrial census listed only 2 carriage manufacturers in Harford County that were, beginning as early as 1803, producing perhaps 10 to 20 carriages per year. The market, however, was growing, and about a century later there were 70 carriage manufacturers scattered around the county, as the horse and carriage was the dominant mode of transportation. The emergence of the automobile in the early 1900s, though, was to doom carriage manufacturing, as well as the buggy whip economy. To build a carriage, there are 2 important parts that demanded special attention. The spoked wheel had to run true and withstand the rigors of a rough road without being damaged. This required the knowledge of a wheelwright and a blacksmith to provide the iron rim that we know today as the tire. The other critical part was the mechanism upon which the 2 front wheels of the carriage rotated for a change of direction, which was called a fifth wheel. Interestingly, the trailer hitches mounted on the bed of a truck today are still called a fifth wheel. The most notable carriage manufacturer in Harford County was Burns Brothers in Havre de Grace, which operated from 1890 to 1918, producing a variety of vehicles, including the Stanhope Trap with a front and back seat, the Cabriolet, designed for a personal driver, the Dayton with a covered top, and the Brougham with an enclosure for the passenger. Burns is best remembered for its 1906 hose reel carriage, built for the Susquehanna Hose Company, that has been restored and preserved in the Community Fire Company of Perryville, across the river from Havertgrace. In the county seat of Bel Air, the Bullitt Carriage Manufacturing Company began operations in 1888 and 2 years later was called the principal industry in the area. The company claimed to be the most extensive and best-equipped carriage factory in the state, employing 60 men and having a capacity to produce over 2,500 vehicles per year. An advertisement boasted that hundreds of vehicles were currently being built in their facility. A fire that started in their paint department destroyed the plant in 1891. For those who would like to see a variety of carriages used in Harford County, visit the Stepping Stone Museum in the Susquehanna State Park. After discovering chromite ore on his father's estate, Isaac Tyson recognized the commercial value of the metal chrome and located significant deposits of the ore in Harford County, northeast of Jarrettsville. He leased ore-bearing property from several individuals and began exporting it out of Baltimore, earning $100 per ton in foreign markets and becoming known as the King of Chrome. The Reed Mine was one of the most productive in Maryland, producing an output of more than 100,000 tons, and roads in the area took on names such as Rocks Chrome and Chrome Hill. In addition to the metal providing a bright, shiny surface, compounds of chrome are used to create the paint colors of chrome green, chrome red, and chrome yellow. The Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad was the first rail line to operate in Harford County, beginning service in 1837. It made stops at Magnolia, where there was an entertainment pavilion, at Aberdeen, and at the Susquehanna River in Havertgrace. In 1837, there was no bridge over the river, so a ferry transported the rail cars across the waterway. In the year 1852, the river was solidly frozen, halting rail traffic, so the railroad company laid tracks across the ice, keeping the railroad running. On the 4th of April, 1883, the first Maryland Central passenger train crossed over Little Gunpowder Falls, entering Harford County, becoming the grandfather of the famous Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad, affectionately known as the Ma and Pa. The standard gauge Ma and Pa began operating in 1901 between Baltimore and York, Pennsylvania, with numerous Harford County stops that included the farming area of Falston, the county seat of Bel Air, the crossroads village of Forest Hill, the charming scenic area of Rocks, the mill hamlet of Pilesville, and the mining town of Cardiff. The Ma and Pa served the diverse needs of Harford County and its people, transporting fertilizer to a warehouse in Falston, hauling flour barrels from Bel Air Roller Mill to market, delivering goods to a general store in Forest Hill, moving cases of canned tomatoes from Rocks to urban areas, transporting Pilesville milk containers to Baltimore, hauling mined minerals from Cardiff, and also delivering mail to communities along its route. In 1954, Ma and Pa passenger service was abandoned, and by 1958, freight service between Baltimore and Whiteford ceased. Today, however, we have part of the line as the famous Ma and Pa Trail. The mineral limestone is produced by aquatic shellfish such as the oyster that brought much fame to the Chesapeake Bay. Piles of oyster shells called middens were left by Native Americans along the shores of the bay and found in early use in mortar for masonry work. It was first necessary to heat the shells in a limestone kiln to drive off carbon dioxide, thus producing quicklime. This was usually done in a stone or brick structure by layering fuel in shells, then heating and letting the powdered quicklime fall through the grate and then be removed. An old Harford County limestone kiln that was operated near Berkeley had several furnaces in parallel built into a hillside. Tanning leather hides required the use of quicklime to first remove hair from the animal's skin, then soaking in tannic acid derived from the bark of black oak trees to cure the leather. In 1844, such work was done in Cooksville, just south of Deer Creek, where a small stream called Mill Brook traversed. One building there contained an animal-powered grinding mill, where the bark was reduced to a powder and dissolved in water. A second building across the road was used to hand-scrape the odorous, rotting flesh from the hide with a knife. This job was most unpleasant, but was somewhat alleviated by a fresh supply of water from the brook, washing the extraneous material away. Thereafter, the hides were buried in the earth that was saturated with tannic acid to cure for as long as 1 year. An area adjacent to Havre de Grace called the Susquehanna Flats was renowned for its migratory wildlife that attracted many sportsmen and women to the region. The flats promoted the growth of wild celery grass that was a favorite food for ducks and geese, which in turn drew in gunners shooting from the shoreline and also firing from so-called sneak boxes. Two celebrities of that era were the Sultan of Swat, Babe Ruth, and Little Miss Sure Shot, Annie Oakley. Since the settlement of Harford County, some colonists had gathered ice during the wintertime and stored the blocks in underground pits to provide some cooling relief during the summer. Beginning about 1860, however, the wintertime commercial harvesting of ice from the Susquehanna River and the closed Tidewater Canal began as a significant business enterprise. Horse-drawn plows cut grooves in the ice that was split into large pieces and floated to the shore by animal power. There, it was broken along the pre-cut grooves into blocks and elevated by a conveyor into huge, well-insulated storage sheds. During the summer, the ice was loaded onto ships for transport to Baltimore, where merchants there delivered it door to door. In the late 1880s, the machine production of so-called artificial ice spelled the end to the wintertime ice gathering. In 1866, George Washington Baker became the canning pioneer in Harford County, packing fruit into tin cans, then adding corn to his offerings. Rather than packaging traditional corn grown for animal feed, he introduced the shoe peg variety that was a county favorite. And later, when marketed by the Mitchell family in Perryman, shoe peg corn gained a reputation outside the area. Many of the county's canneries were located along a rail line where they could receive tin cans from Baltimore and, after filling with farm produce, ship their products back to the city. A few of these canneries were John W. Macklem's Spring Valley Tomatoes, Falston brand tomatoes, packed by the Maryland Canned Goods Company, Flora brand tomatoes, packed by S.J. Seneca of Havre de Grace, W.E. Robinson's Rockland brand cream corn, Pride of Sharon sweet corn, packed by Samuel J. Adie, and John W. Birkin's Chestnut Hill tomatoes that were packed in Forest Hill. Flint is the common name for crystalline quartz that some will associate with an old flintlock gun or rifle, as when a piece is chipped away, it produces a spark that can ignite gunpowder. It was also used by Native Americans as arrowheads, but its most commercial application was a powder additive to white clay to make porcelain items such as dishes. In 1869, preparing the quartz powder required several steps. After chunks of flint were mined, it was first heated in a tall furnace. Upon cooling, the flint was then crushed with large rollers, usually turned by water power. The resulting flint particles were subsequently ground into flint powder. This last operation was done underwater, as ongoing exposure to fine flint particles was unhealthy. Finally, the flint powder, or so-called flour, was dried and packed into bags for transport to a pottery factory. The mineral serpentine was mined in several parts of Harford County as early as the 1870s, with most production coming from the area of Cardiff. Serpentine is basically light green, exhibiting splotches of black-green interspersed with irregular white and sometimes orca veins. When serpentine is polished, it's commonly called green marble. In 1876, the Grace Memorial Episcopal Church in Darlington was constructed with serpentine, and inside there's a polished column of the stone. Serpentine found its way into the lobby of the Empire State Building in New York City and can also be seen in the old Bel Air Post Office, now the home of the Historical Society of Harford County. The Cardiff Quarry closed in 1977, and the site is now the home of Green Marble Recycling. In 1906, a new steel railroad bridge over the Susquehanna River was opened, and the old parallel bridge was abandoned. The federal government wanted the old bridge to be removed, but the railroad estimated the cost would be $65,000, and they failed to take action. As the Havre de Grace government had no interest, a group of 7 local men formed the Havre de Grace and Perryville Bridge Company, and in 1908 accepted the bridge as a gift from the railroad. They spent $89,000 converting it to a 2-level vehicular bridge and charged a crossing toll. As automobile traffic rose, they were financially well rewarded and eventually sold the so-called Gold Mine Bridge to the state of Maryland for $585,000. By 1910, there were many dairy farms in Harford County that depended on the Ma and Pa Railroad for delivery of their milk to the market in Baltimore. The farmers would get up early, milk the cows, and empty the milk in 5-gallon cans that were immersed in spring water to cool. Thereafter, they would be transferred onto a wagon and pulled by a horse to one of the railroad stations. Each station had a trackside platform where the cans, with a brass tag identifying the owners, would be placed, and later picked up by a train originating from York and heading to Baltimore, called the Milky Way. An afternoon train would return the washed cans to the farmers for refilling and pick up the next day. Horse racing had begun in Havre de Grace as early as 1785 and occasionally continued up until 1878, when a trotting match was advertised. It would be 1912, though, when the Maryland General Assembly authorized horse racing and on-site betting at a 1-mile track just south of the town. The sport got off to a running start, but the dust haze from the hooves of the pounding ponies created a storm cloud, with some demanding that the betting and gambling be stopped. It would continue, however, until 1950, while horse racing in Bel Air ran until 1962. The first use of Harford County soapstone likely dates to Native Americans, who early on visited a site adjacent to Robinson Mill Road in the Broad Creek Memorial Scout Reservation. It's known as the Ore Prehistoric Ceatite or Soapstone Quarry. There they found a stone of the approximate size of the desired object, and using a bone or flint knife, carved away the unwanted portion to achieve the desired shape. If an internal flaw was exposed, or if the stone broke, it could be discarded, and this on-site work served to minimize the weight that had to be transported back to their village. In 1916, the Harford Talc Company began operation in the general location of Dublin Road and Mill Green Road, mining soapstone and shipping it to manufacturers who ground it into talcum powder. By 1933, a new owner had taken over, who began machining the stone into insulators for electrical and electronic applications. Also, some of their product was sent to Canada, where artisans there carved it into figurines. Operating as the Maryland Lava Company, the business is still ongoing.
And still ongoing today is our reverence for Harford County's rich and diverse heritage, exemplified by the Ma and Pa Trail. As noted by one rail enthusiast, the Ma and Pa's 77 miles of rails connecting 2 cities just 45 miles apart might not have been as long as some other railroads, but it was just as wide.